Tortures throughout history. We are embarking on a journey into the depths of history. In this video, we will witness some of the darkest moments of human history, uncovering terrifying practices where civilizations turned their quest for justice into horrific punishments and brutal execution methods. From ancient times to the Middle Ages, these merciless methods, shaped in the shadow of wars and power struggles, reveal the most savage aspects of human nature. These events, each ending in tragedy, remind us how societies transformed under fear and oppression, and how human dignity was tested throughout history. If you're ready, let's delve into the most ruthless and unforgettable moments in human history together. 1. The sack torture, pena culiae. Ancient Rome. What is it? The sack torture, known in Latin as pena culiae, was an extremely cruel punishment method used in ancient Rome, particularly for those guilty of patricide. This method, which punished the convict both physically and psychologically, also served to warn the public of the seriousness of the crime and acted as a deterrent. How was it carried out? The convict would first be severely whipped to make them feel the gravity of their crime. The convict would be placed in a leather sack along with live animals. The sack often contained the following animals: snakes, chosen for their venomous and dangerous nature; dogs, selected for their aggressive temperament; roosters or chickens, included to create constant chaos with their movement; monkeys, known for their aggression and ability to create a tense environment. The selection of these animals was not random. Each had symbolic significance. For instance, snakes symbolized evil and impurity. Execution. The sack was tightly sealed and thrown into a river, lake, or sea, ensuring the convict and the animals inside drowned. The convict faced not only the danger of drowning, but also the attacks of the animals inside the sack. This made it a terrifying and agonizing form of death. Purpose and symbolism. Social order. The sack torture was designed to send a harsh message against crimes like patricide, which threatened the social order. This punishment aimed to instill fear and serve as a cautionary tale. Corruption of purity. The animals inside the sack symbolized the corruption of societal purity and the unnatural nature of the convict's crime. Public display. This punishment was often carried out in public spaces. Watching this horrifying execution deterred potential criminals. The sack torture was not only physical but also psychological. The convict endured bites, scratches, and attacks from live animals, struggled to breathe inside a dark, confined sack, ultimately drowned. Drowning was considered one of the most terrifying deaths, and the added torment from the animals amplified this fear. The helplessness of the victim made the execution even more harrowing. Historical scope and examples. The sack torture was practiced from the early periods of ancient Rome. While it was primarily used for patricides, it was occasionally applied to those who killed other family members. Roman jurist Julius Paulus documented the details of this punishment, classifying pena culiae among the harshest penalties in the legal system. Modern perspective. Today, sack torture is regarded as an inhumane and excessively cruel method. However, this punishment provides an important historical insight into ancient Roman justice and their approach to the relationship between crime and punishment.
2. Torture by impalement. Ottoman Empire and medieval Europe. What is it? Impalement was a highly cruel and agonizing torture method historically employed by sadistic leaders like Vlad Tepes, commonly known as Vlad the Impaler. This method involved using a sharp stake that was gradually driven through the victim's body, combining physical and psychological torment. This execution was often carried out in public to instill fear and ensure submission. How was it carried out? Preparing the victim. The convict was brought to the execution site and immobilized by tying their hands or feet. Insertion of the stake. A long, sharp stake, often lubricated at the tip, was inserted into the lower body of the victim, typically through the anus or vagina. The stake was carefully angled to avoid damaging vital organs, ensuring it would emerge from the upper torso, such as the shoulder or mouth. Prolonged death. The victim's body weight caused the stake to slowly penetrate further, making the process last for hours or even days. If the stake's tip was not very sharp, the victim's death was prolonged further, intensifying their suffering. Vlad the Impaler and his use of impalement. Vlad Tepes, the Impaler. This method became synonymous with Vlad Tepes, the 15th century prince of Wallachia. Vlad used impalement to punish enemies and rebellious subjects, displaying impaled victims outside his fortress as a warning. Psychological objective. Vlad's aim was not just to execute his enemies, but also to deter others by creating a lasting impression of terror. Symbolism and purpose. Fear and obedience. Impalement was used to instill fear in both the public and enemies, reinforcing the ruler's authority. Social control. Punishing criminals and rebels publicly served as a spectacle to maintain societal order. A symbol of power. This brutal method symbolized the ruler's strength and cruelty, serving as a warning to anyone considering rebellion. Pain and death process. Physical pain. The process of the stake penetrating the body, tearing through internal organs, caused unbearable pain. This torturous ordeal could last for hours or even days. Psychological torment. Victims endured severe mental anguish, knowing death was inevitable but painfully slow. Public display. These executions were often conducted in public, forcing onlookers to witness the gruesome punishment as a deterrent. Historical examples. The legend of Vlad Tepes. Vlad is said to have impaled over 20,000 people during the Ottoman invasion, displaying the bodies like a forest of stakes, which came to be known as the Forest of the Impaled. His infamy earned him the title Kazikli Voivoda, the Impaler Prince. Vlad grew up in the Ottoman court alongside Sultan Mehmed II, learning strategies of warfare, governance, and military tactics. However, he later turned against the Ottomans, using this knowledge to inflict immense suffering on his people and Ottoman soldiers. Eventually, Sultan Mehmed II waged war to end Vlad's tyranny. Vlad was defeated in battle and fled. Vlad Tepes' brutal legacy inspired Bram Stoker's Dracula, making him a symbol of both terror and vampire mythology. Medieval Europe. Impalement was not exclusive to Vlad Tepes' era. In medieval Europe, it was occasionally used to punish traitors and individuals guilty of severe crimes. Modern perspective. Today, impalement is regarded as an inhumane and excessively cruel form of execution. However, it serves as a striking historical example of how societies in the past approached concepts of justice, fear, and authority. Vlad Tepes' frequent use of this method remains one of the most vivid reflections of his tyrannical rule.
3. Bamboo torture. Asian cultures. Historical background. Bamboo torture is an extraordinarily creative yet terrifying method of execution that results in a slow and unbearable death by combining physical pain with the forces of nature. This method holds a unique place in history for utilizing the natural properties of bamboo as a tool for torture. Although accounts suggest it was used in Japan and certain Asian societies, concrete evidence of its use is limited. Nevertheless, the stories reveal humanity's cruel ingenuity. What is bamboo torture? Bamboo torture is one of the most bizarre and horrifying execution methods in human history. Known to have been practiced in Asian cultures, particularly in Southeast Asia, this form of torture leverages bamboo's incredible growth rate to inflict a painful death, showcasing the use of nature as a punishment tool. How was it performed? Preparing the victim. The victim was tightly bound over an area with bamboo shoots growing beneath them. The victim was immobilized, ensuring they could not resist or escape the growth of the bamboo shoots. The growth of bamboo shoots. Bamboo plants can grow up to 5 to 10 centimeters, 2 to 4 inches, per day under ideal conditions. This rapid growth was the foundation of the torture. The sharp bamboo shoots would gradually pierce the victim's skin and continue to grow, reaching internal organs over several days. As the bamboo shoots penetrated the body, the victim experienced unbearable pain, with death occurring from organ damage or infections caused by the injuries. The onset of pain. The process began with the shoots piercing the skin. As they continued to grow, they slowly tore through the victim's muscles, organs, and even bones. This agonizing process could last for several days, subjecting the victim to prolonged and excruciating pain. Duration. Bamboo torture did not lead to an instant death. Its primary purpose was to make the victim endure the pain for as long as possible. Victims typically died from infections, organ damage, blood loss, or the sheer agony of the process. Purpose. Psychological and physical torture. Bamboo torture not only inflicted extreme physical pain, but also caused severe psychological trauma by leaving the victim utterly helpless. Being subjected to the unstoppable force of nature created a profound sense of fear and despair in the victim. Enforcing obedience. This method was often employed to extract information, force confessions, or intimidate communities. A social message. Bamboo torture was used to instill fear and demonstrate authority. Hearing or witnessing the horrifying details of this method deterred people from defying the ruling power. Who used it? Japan and certain Asian regions. According to accounts, this method was particularly associated with Japan and some parts of Southeast Asia. However, there is little archaeological or written evidence to confirm its widespread use. Most stories about bamboo torture have survived as legends or cautionary tales. Repressive regimes. Bamboo torture was more often employed as a means of intimidation and submission rather than a common execution method. Effects. Physical effects. As the bamboo shoots grew, they pierced the skin, muscles, and internal organs, causing excruciating pain with every millimeter of growth. Victims succumbed to infections, internal bleeding, and organ damage. Psychological effects. The victim experienced not only immense pain, but also the terror of being completely at the mercy of nature. The prolonged nature of the process broke their mental resilience. Outcome and impacts. Physical pain. One of the most horrifying aspects of this method was the slow progression, allowing the victim to remain conscious and endure extreme pain for an extended period. Psychological torture. Bamboo torture relied on the victim's awareness of the inevitability of their death, creating an intense psychological breakdown over time. Deterrence and fear. This method created widespread fear among observers, further solidifying the authority of those who employed it. The slow and agonizing nature of the punishment heightened the horror it instilled. Symbolism and cultural context. The use of nature's power. Bamboo torture represents the use of natural forces as an execution method. The sharp, sturdy bamboo shoots symbolize both cruelty and the unstoppable power of nature. Traditional punishment practices. This method highlights how Asian cultures sometimes incorporated moral and symbolic lessons into their forms of punishment, making executions a means of deterrence and reinforcement of authority. Additional details. Hardness of bamboo shoots. As bamboo grows, its tips harden and acquire a sharp, piercing quality similar to metal, allowing the shoots to easily penetrate human skin and tissue. Natural process and duration. The torture relied on bamboo's slow but powerful growth process, which could take days to kill the victim, prolonging their suffering. Place in Asian cultures. While this method is said to have been used in various regions of Asia, it was particularly employed to punish war prisoners or enemies, according to legends. In conclusion, bamboo torture is remembered as one of history's most terrifying methods of punishment. Modern perspective. Bamboo torture is regarded as one of the most inhumane and unimaginable forms of torture in human history. By combining the forces of nature with human cruelty, it inflicted both physical and psychological suffering. Today, this method is seen as a chilling example of how far humanity has gone in inventing brutal practices. The use of nature's destructive power as a punishment tool underscores the intertwining of justice and cruelty throughout history. Thankfully, such practices have been relegated to the dark pages of history thanks to modern human rights treaties. Nevertheless, these past atrocities remind us of the importance of safeguarding justice and human dignity.
4. Saw torture, medieval Europe. With saw torture. Saw torture was an extremely brutal and inhumane method of execution used in medieval Europe for crimes such as heresy, treason, and witchcraft. This method aimed to prolong the victim's suffering by suspending them upside down, which slowed blood loss and delayed unconsciousness, ensuring a lengthy and painful ordeal. How was it performed? Preparing the victim. The victim was tied or hung upside down from a tree, post, or other structure. Being upside down caused blood to pool in the head due to gravity, delaying unconsciousness and extending the victim's awareness of the pain. The sawing process. The executioners would typically begin sawing from the groin area, working their way toward the torso. In some cases, the process was carried out until the victim's body was fully bisected. However, more often, the victim would die from the pain, shock, or blood loss before the sawing was complete. Gravity caused blood to accumulate in the lower body, which slowed the rate of bleeding and prolonged the victim's death. The victim usually died before the sawing process was completed due to shock and immense pain. Consciousness was intentionally maintained as long as possible to maximize the suffering. Who used it? Medieval Europe. This method was primarily used for individuals convicted of heresy, treason, or witchcraft. Church and civil authorities. The church often employed saw torture against individuals deemed heretics, using it as a means to maintain religious authority and social order. Public deterrence. The punishments were typically carried out in public to instill fear in the populace and discourage rebellion or dissent. Purpose and effects. Physical and psychological torture. The primary goal of saw torture was to inflict unbearable pain and prolong it as much as possible. Public executions also aimed to humiliate the victim and serve as a psychological warning to the audience. Deterrence. Saw torture was designed to deter others from committing similar crimes by instilling fear and demonstrating the consequences of disobedience. Observers were forced to witness the severity of the punishment, reinforcing the power of authority and law. Symbolism. Starting the sawing process at the groin carried a symbolic message, often associated with moral corruption or sexual deviance. It was also intended to portray the victim as someone completely removed from sanctity and righteousness, further justifying their punishment. Outcomes and cruelty. Prolonged death. The death process could take hours. Gravity slowed the loss of blood, prolonging the victim's suffering and delaying death. Societal fear. Methods like saw torture served as more than just a punishment for the condemned. They were a clear message to society. These barbaric executions created a physically and psychologically terrifying effect on those who witnessed them. Historical and cultural context. Medieval punishment practices. Like many torture methods used in medieval Europe, saw torture was not only a means of punishment, but also a tool for maintaining social order. Both church and state utilized this method to harshly punish those who challenged their authority. Religious context. In cases of heresy, the punishment was often seen as a way to cleanse the individual spiritually as well as physically. Saw torture was adopted as a method to fulfill this belief. Modern perspective. Today, saw torture is studied as a historical example of how cruel and inhumane justice systems could be in the past. It illustrates the extent to which punishment was used as a tool for fear and control rather than fairness or rehabilitation. This method, like many others from the medieval period, highlights the barbarity of historical justice systems while also emphasizing the progress made in human rights and modern justice practices. Saw torture is now regarded as a dark stain on history and a reminder of the importance of protecting human dignity in the pursuit of justice.
5. The Iron Maiden punishment. Historical background. The Iron Maiden is known as one of the most iconic torture devices of medieval Europe. Its form and method of use combine a terrifying aesthetic with a representation of cruelty and inhuman practices. While sources claim that this device was particularly used in Germany for torture and executions, historians debate whether it was real or merely a myth. Nevertheless, its prominent place among torture methods reflects the violent mentality of the era. What is the Iron Maiden punishment? The Iron Maiden was a human-sized cabinet-like torture device lined with sharp spikes on the inside. Its purpose was to inflict unbearable pain on the victim before death, while also instilling fear in the public. However, whether the device was actually used or existed only as a symbolic deterrent is a matter of ongoing historical debate. How was it used? Structure of the device. The Iron Maiden was typically a cabinet resembling the shape of a human, with sharp iron spikes lining its interior. The cabinet was roughly the size of a person and designed to fit the victim's body closely. Placing the victim. The victim was carefully placed inside the device, with their movements entirely restricted. Their body would come into contact with the sharp spikes inside the cabinet, which were typically positioned to avoid immediate damage to vital organs. Closing the doors. The doors of the Iron Maiden were slowly closed, causing the spikes to pierce the victim's body. This process was usually carried out in a way that prolonged the victim's suffering without causing instant death. The spikes would puncture the skin, muscles, and sometimes bones of the victim. Prolonged torture. The design of the Iron Maiden prevented quick death, forcing the victim to endure prolonged pain. The victim would slowly bleed out from the puncture wounds. Holes in the device allowed the victim's screams to be heard and the torture to be witnessed by others. Purpose. Psychological and physical torture. The victim was left in a state of utter helplessness and fear, in addition to enduring immense physical pain. The Iron Maiden was designed to maximize suffering before death, instilling public fear. The device was used as a tool to reinforce authority and obedience in society. People were deterred from opposing authority out of fear of such a gruesome fate. Extracting confessions. Another purpose of the torture was to force confessions from the victim, often during religious interrogations or political trials. Who used it? Medieval Europe. The Iron Maiden is said to have been used primarily in Germany for torture purposes, though it represents the broader understanding of medieval torture methods in Europe. It was thought to be employed especially during inquisitorial trials or political interrogations. Religious and political authorities. Torture was a tool used by both religious and political powers to maintain control and authority. In this context, the Iron Maiden became a symbol of oppression and dominance. Outcomes. Physical effects. The victim would experience significant blood loss due to the multiple puncture wounds, which would lead to a slow and agonizing death. The risk of infection was extremely high due to the unclean nature of the spikes, often resulting in unbearable pain and death from sepsis. Psychological effects. The victim would also suffer from claustrophobia and terror, being confined in a dark and tight space. The anticipation of death and the continuous pain caused severe psychological torment. Death. Death could occur within hours to days, caused by blood loss, infection, or sheer physical exhaustion. Historical and ethical evaluation. The Iron Maiden is considered one of the most brutal torture devices in human history. However, whether it was genuinely used or merely served as a symbolic fear-inducing object remains a subject of historical debate. Some historians argue that the Iron Maiden was not used for actual torture, but was instead designed as a propaganda tool to intimidate the public. Regardless of its actual use, the device reflects humanity's capacity for cruelty and the dark side of historical justice systems. Its design and purpose highlight the oppressive and violent nature of medieval society, while serving as a reminder of how far modern justice and human rights have progressed. Conclusion. The Iron Maiden is one of the most infamous torture methods of medieval Europe. Its terrifying design and functionality have earned it a place in history as a tool of fear used by oppressive regimes to enforce societal compliance. While its existence and use are still debated, its symbolism remains a powerful reminder of the inhumanity of past practices. Today, the banning of such cruel methods serves as a testament to the development of human rights and justice systems, marking a significant achievement in the progress of humanity toward fairness and dignity.
Six. Scaphism, Ancient Persian Empire. What is scaphism? Scaphism was one of the most brutal and horrifying torture and execution methods practiced in the ancient Persian Empire. This method was designed to ensure the victim's body was slowly consumed by insects. Also known as the boat torture, it led to an excruciatingly cruel death, both physically and psychologically. How was it carried out? Preparation. The victim was placed inside two hollowed-out boats or a wooden box. The interior of the boats was adjusted to fit the victim's body perfectly. The victim was tied in such a way that only their head, hands, and feet remained exposed. Honey and milk mixture. The victim's body, especially the face, arms, chest, and genital areas, was smeared with a sticky mixture of honey and milk. This sweet mixture was used to attract insects, flies, and other pests. Forced feeding. The victim was force-fed with the same honey and milk mixture repeatedly. This caused severe diarrhea and led to the accumulation of excrement inside the boat. The excrement created an ideal environment for insects to multiply and attack the victim. Natural environment. The boat was left in a swamp or a hot and humid area. This environment accelerated the growth of insects and facilitated the destruction of the victim's body as insects consumed their flesh. Outcome: slow and painful death. The victim endured unbearable pain for days or even weeks. Insects gradually ate away at the victim's body, piercing through tissues and internal organs. The victim's body weakened further due to constant feeding, diarrhea, and infections. Infection and decay. Open wounds would form on the victim's body and quickly become infected. The decaying tissue intensified the insect attacks, accelerating the destruction process. The victim usually died from septic shock, organ failure, or extreme exhaustion caused by starvation and dehydration. Purpose: deterrence. This method was used both to punish the victim and to instill fear and obedience among the populace. The prolonged and gruesome nature of the torture emphasized the power of authority and the ruthlessness of justice. Psychological impact. It aimed to leave a profound psychological effect on both the victim and those who witnessed the punishment. This method was sometimes carried out in public to serve as a warning to others. Historical and cultural context. Persian justice system. Punishments in the ancient Persian Empire were extremely severe and designed to deter crime. Scaphism was reserved for the most serious offenses. It was believed to be used for crimes such as treason, betrayal, or defiance against the king's authority. Between myth and reality. Scaphism was documented by the ancient Greek historian Plutarch. However, it is unclear how widespread or genuinely practiced this method was. Some historians suggest that it might have been more of a legend or propaganda tool to intimidate enemies. Cruelty and inhumanity. Physical torture. The victim's body was subjected to both external and internal assaults. Insects devoured the flesh externally, while diarrhea and infections caused the body to decay from within. Psychological torture. The victim experienced every moment of the prolonged death process with full consciousness, enduring an agonizing sense of hopelessness. Modern perspective. Scaphism is regarded as one of history's most barbaric and horrifying torture methods, illustrating the extent to which human rights could be violated. This method serves as a historical example of how inhumane techniques were employed to showcase the power of authority. At the same time, reflecting on such dark practices emphasizes the significance of modern legal systems and human rights. The lessons learned from these grim chapters of history highlight the importance of justice systems that prioritize fairness, dignity, and humanity. Conclusion. Scaphism is one of the most infamous methods of torture from the ancient Persian Empire. Its terrifying and grotesque nature has earned it a place in history as an instrument of fear and dominance used by oppressive regimes. While its historical authenticity is debated, its symbolism remains a stark reminder of humanity's capacity for cruelty. In contrast, the outlawing of such methods today marks a crucial milestone in the progress of human rights and justice systems worldwide.
7. Rat torture. Historical background. Rat torture is one of the inhumane methods of torture known to have been practiced, particularly during medieval Europe. This method was designed not only to inflict physical pain, but also to create deep psychological terror for the victim. By turning the hunger and survival instincts of rats into tools of torture, the cruelty of this technique was amplified. Etched into Europe's dark past, this method stood out as a tool of fear and authority during the period. What is it? Rat torture is regarded as one of the most horrifying and brutal methods of torture ever used. This technique relied on the savage manipulation of animals' instinctual behaviors to inflict pain upon the victim. Primarily applied to political offenders during the Middle Ages, this method was a blend of both physical and psychological torment. How was it carried out? Preparation. The victim was typically laid flat on their back and tightly restrained to completely immobilize them. Their abdomen was exposed to allow access for the rats. Placement of rats. A cage, often made of metal or wood and open on one side, was placed over the victim's bare abdomen. Several hungry rats were placed inside the cage. These rats had usually been starved beforehand to increase their aggression. Heating the cage. A heat source, such as fire, hot metal, or embers, was placed on top of the cage. As the temperature rose, the rats panicked and sought an escape route, with the victim's body being their only way out. Rats' escape attempt. To escape the heat, the rats would claw and gnaw their way into the victim's body. The rats would burrow into the victim's abdomen, tearing through tissues and potentially reaching internal organs, causing unbearable pain. Outcome: physical pain and injury. The rats would dig into the victim's abdomen, causing deep wounds and severe bleeding. As the rats burrowed further, they would damage internal tissues and organs, leading to an excruciating and bloody process. Psychological torture. The victim experienced not only the physical pain, but also the sheer terror of being attacked by rats. The sound and movement of the rats scrambling to escape the heat would add to the victim's psychological collapse. Death. The victim typically died from internal bleeding, infections, or organ failure, with death occurring anywhere from a few hours to several days after the torture began. Purpose: deterrence and public disgrace. This method was used to instill fear in society and discourage criminal behavior. The gruesome nature of the victim's death served to disgrace them and highlight the severity of their crimes. Psychological pressure. Rat torture was designed to terrify not only the victim but also any witnesses, showcasing the power and cruelty of those in authority. Historical and cultural context. Regions and time periods of use. Rat torture was commonly practiced in medieval Europe. It is known to have been used on individuals accused of political crimes, treason, or other serious offenses. Historical accounts. This method has been recorded as one of the most terrifying forms of punishment used during the Middle Ages. It was often employed as a tool to intimidate those who dared to challenge authority. Cruelty and inhumanity. Physical and psychological effects. Rat torture not only inflicted unbearable physical pain, but also caused mental anguish for the victim. The uncontrollable aggression of the rats and the victim's helplessness intensified the unbearable nature of the torture. Impact on society. Witnesses to such methods lived in fear of the authorities' power and the harshness of its punishments. This fear served as a tool for rulers to maintain control over the populace. Historical and ethical reflection. Rat torture is widely considered one of the most barbaric methods of torture in human history. The rulers of the time used such cruel methods as tools of fear and control. However, these practices represent a dark and shameful period in history. In today's understanding of human rights, such practices are entirely outlawed and condemned. Reflecting on such events highlights the importance of modern legal systems that prioritize the protection of human rights and dignity. Conclusion. Rat torture inflicted not only physical pain, but also deep psychological trauma on its victims. Methods like these showcase how human creativity can be directed toward cruelty, while also revealing how fear and submission were used as tools of control over society. The complete prohibition of such practices today is a testament to the lessons learned from history's darkest chapters. By understanding and acknowledging these past atrocities, we can better appreciate the development of justice systems that protect human rights and uphold ethical standards.
8. The breaking wheel, Catherine wheel. What is it? The breaking wheel was one of history's most brutal execution methods, designed to instill fear and maintain public order. Named after the wheel used in the process, this torture method aimed at physically breaking the condemned and causing them to die in agony. Conducted in public, these executions served not only to punish the criminal but also to provide a deterrent spectacle for society. How was it carried out? Preparation. The condemned person was tied to a large wooden wheel, often resembling a wagon wheel or a similar structure. The limbs were tightly secured to the wheel's spokes, leaving the victim unable to move. Spinning and beating. The wheel was spun with the victim on it, facilitating the breaking of limbs. As the wheel turned, executioners struck the victim's limbs with iron bars or heavy hammers. The breaking process. The torture typically started with the ankles and wrists, progressing to the knees, elbows, and larger joints. If the executioner was feeling merciful, a blow to the neck could end the victim's life quickly. However, in most cases, the torture was prolonged for maximum suffering. The process continued until the victim's body was completely broken and disfigured. Public display. The victim, still tied to the wheel, was hoisted onto a tall pole for public display. In some cases, the broken body remained on display for days to serve as both a deterrent and a humiliation for the condemned. The outcome: physical destruction and death. The victim's limbs were shattered, and their body was reduced to a misshapen form. Death usually resulted from immense pain, shock, or blood loss, though in some cases, it could take hours or even days. Psychological impact. The horror of the torture, combined with its public display, deeply affected both the victim and the spectators. Purpose: deterrence. Public executions using the breaking wheel were meant to deter others by showcasing the consequences of committing crimes. The spectacle reminded people of the dire cost of disobedience or rebellion. Social control. The display of the victim's corpse on the wheel created a lasting psychological impact, reinforcing the power of the ruling authorities. Justice of the time. In the Middle Ages, the concept of justice revolved around punishments proportional to the crime. The breaking wheel was reserved for the most severe offenses. Historical context and use. We used it. The breaking wheel was a common execution method in medieval Europe. The duration and method of torture varied based on the crime and the executioner's discretion. What crimes was it used for? It was typically used for serious crimes such as murder, rebellion, treason, and heresy. This method was also intended to destroy the criminal's reputation by publicly humiliating them. The cruelty of the execution process. Systematic limb shattering. Executioners often planned the sequence of bone breaking to prolong the victim's suffering. Death blows were typically delayed to ensure the victim endured as much pain as possible. A test of endurance. The torture became a ritualized test of the victim's physical and psychological endurance. Public reaction. Crowds were often encouraged to attend these executions, which served to reinforce loyalty to the ruling authority and discourage crime. Modern perspective. The breaking wheel is recognized as one of the most inhumane punishment methods in human history. Once used as a tool to demonstrate power and instill fear, it is now completely banned under modern understandings of human rights. Such practices serve as grim reminders of the importance of upholding human dignity and the progress made in modern legal systems. The breaking wheel remains a symbol of a time when physical pain and public spectacle were used to enforce social order and authority. Conclusion. The breaking wheel caused not only immense physical suffering but also served as a tool for societal fear and control. These methods highlight how cruelty and innovation were combined to maintain authority and suppress dissent. Today, the universal condemnation of such practices is a testament to the lessons learned from history's darkest moments. The breaking wheel stands as a historical reminder of the importance of justice systems that respect human rights and uphold ethical principles.
9. Crucifixion. Historical background. Crucifixion is considered one of the oldest and most brutal methods of execution in human history. This method was particularly prevalent in the Roman Empire, where it was used to instill fear and discipline within society. Designed to humiliate, inflict severe physical and psychological pain, and serve as a public deterrent, crucifixion was a form of punishment with far-reaching consequences. It became widely recognized worldwide due to the crucifixion of Jesus, which gave it profound symbolic significance in religious contexts. What is crucifixion? Crucifixion was one of the most notorious and terrifying execution methods of the Roman era. It involved nailing or binding the condemned to a cross or a similar structure and leaving them to die. Combining physical and psychological torture, it became a memorable form of public execution. How was it carried out? Preparation process. The condemned was typically taken to a public place where the torture could be witnessed by a crowd. As part of the punishment, the condemned was often forced to carry their own crossbeam. This journey was both physically and psychologically devastating. Securing to the cross. The condemned person was laid on their back on a wooden structure, often shaped like a T or a cross. Nails were driven through the wrists or palms to secure the arms to the wood. The feet were either overlapped and nailed with a single spike or nailed or tied separately to the upright post. If nails were insufficient, ropes were used to further secure the body to the cross. Raising the cross. Once the condemned was nailed or tied, The cross was lifted into a vertical position. This not only intensified the pain by shifting the body weight, but also ensured that the entire scene was visible to onlookers. The process of death. Death from crucifixion was excruciatingly slow and painful. The body's weight hanging on the arms made breathing increasingly difficult. Over time, the victims suffocated as their chest muscles weakened. Additional factors such as dehydration, exhaustion, infection, and blood loss hastened death. In some cases, death occurred within hours. In others, it could take days. The outcome: physical pain. Crucifixion caused unbearable physical agony as the body was forced into an unnatural posture. The nails caused deep wounds, muscles were stretched to their limits, and blood vessels were damaged, creating excruciating pain. Psychological torment. The condemned was left to die in full view of the public. This was not only physically torturous, but also deeply humiliating. Dying under the gaze of the crowd shattered the victim's spirit as well as their body. Death. The primary cause of death was often asphyxiation, as the chest muscles became too weak to support breathing. Dehydration, starvation, and infections also contributed to the prolonged agony and eventual death. Purpose of crucifixion: deterrence and demonstration of power. Crucifixion was used primarily for crimes such as rebellion, treason, and severe offenses. Public executions sent a clear warning to others, demonstrating the power of the authorities and the consequences of disobedience. Social control. In authoritarian states like the Roman Empire, crucifixion was a tool to instill fear and ensure obedience. Conducting these executions publicly served as a strategic method of maintaining societal order. Humiliation and disgrace. Crucifixion was not just about killing the victim, but also about utterly destroying their reputation. Displaying the body in public reduced the individual to a figure of shame and ostracism. Historical context and examples. Who used crucifixion? Crucifixion was widespread in the Roman Empire, where it was a systematic form of punishment. Other cultures also practiced crucifixion sporadically, though not as systematically as the Romans. Famous historical example: the crucifixion of Jesus Christ. This is the most well-known and symbolic instance of crucifixion. The crucifixion of Jesus exemplifies how this method was used against both religious and political leaders, showcasing its dual purpose as punishment and public intimidation. Frequent scenarios. Crucifixion was often used to punish rebellious slaves and leaders of uprisings. For example, following the Spartacus rebellion, thousands of slaves were crucified along the Appian Way as a warning to others. Modern perspective. Crucifixion is remembered as one of the most barbaric methods of execution in human history. Once used by ancient regimes as a means of control and demonstration of power, it is now universally condemned as inhumane. The abolition of such practices reflects the progress made in human rights and legal systems. Today, crucifixion stands as a grim reminder of the cruelty of past authoritarian regimes and their disregard for human dignity. Ethical and historical reflections. Lessons from history. Crucifixion, with its extreme physical and psychological cruelty, highlights the lengths to which societies went to maintain control and authority. As a form of punishment, it was more than just an execution. It was a means of projecting fear and dominance. Reflecting on these practices reminds us of the importance of protecting human rights and ensuring justice. Symbolism and legacy. Crucifixion is not just a historical event, but also a symbol of sacrifice, injustice, and human endurance. Remembering these dark chapters of history serves as a call to build a more compassionate and just world. Conclusion. Crucifixion was one of the most severe forms of physical and psychological torture in history, both for the individual condemned and for society as a whole. It represented the peak of human cruelty and a chilling reminder of the abuse of power. Although these methods now belong to history's darkest pages, they serve as critical lessons on the value of human dignity and the ongoing need to protect justice and human rights.
10. Quartering. Quartering, a brutal method of execution. Quartering stands as one of the most inhumane and violent execution methods in history. This punishment was especially used in England against those deemed traitors. The condemned person's body was torn apart by pulling the limbs in opposite directions, leading to their death. This method also served as a display of power, reinforcing authority and control over society. How was it carried out? Public display. The condemned person was usually taken to a public space. It was common for torture to be inflicted beforehand to increase both physical injuries and psychological pressure. Binding the body. The individual was laid on the ground, and their arms and legs were tied with ropes or chains. Each limb was attached to a rope fastened to 4 separate horses. The execution. At the command of the executioners, the horses were driven in opposite directions. As the horses pulled, the condemned's body was torn apart. In many cases, the muscles and joints would stretch and tear before the body was fully dismembered, causing excruciating pain. Ultimately, the immense force of the horses led to the body being torn into 4 parts. Although death was usually swift once dismemberment occurred, there were instances where the process was prolonged, subjecting the individual to unbearable agony. In some cases, axes or similar tools were reportedly used to aid in the dismemberment. The psychological and physical impact. Physical agony. The process of quartering inflicted unimaginable pain. The slow stretching of muscles and tearing of joints turned the final moments of the condemned into a horrifying experience. Psychological torment. Beyond the physical suffering, quartering aimed to completely destroy the dignity of the condemned. The public nature of the execution amplified the humiliation and served as a chilling warning to all onlookers. Slow death. While the dismemberment often resulted in an instant death, in some cases the process was delayed, forcing the individual to endure several minutes of unbearable pain before succumbing. Purpose of quartering. Punishment for treason. Quartering was primarily reserved for acts of treason. It sent a clear and terrifying message to the public that traitors would meet a gruesome end. Propaganda tool. This method was not only a punishment but also a demonstration of the state's power. It served as a propaganda tool, reinforcing the idea that crimes against the state or monarchy would not go unpunished. Public fear and control. The execution was always conducted in public to instill fear and ensure absolute obedience to state authority. Who used quartering? Prevalence in England. Quartering was widely practiced during the Middle Ages and the Renaissance in England. It was particularly used against individuals who rebelled against the king or the state, or those declared as traitors. Historical example. William Wallace, 1305, the famous Scottish leader who fought for Scotland's independence, was declared a traitor by England and executed by quartering. His death remains one of the most infamous instances of this method. Modern perspective. Quartering is remembered as one of the most barbaric forms of punishment in human history. Today, such practices are universally condemned as gross violations of human rights. Historical reflection. In the past, quartering was not merely a method of punishment but also a means of societal control. It instilled fear in the populace and demonstrated the extent to which authorities would go to maintain power and order. Legacy. These methods serve as a dark reminder of humanity's capacity for cruelty. The abolition of such punishments is a testament to the progress made in promoting human rights and justice. Ethical and historical reflections. Lessons from history. Quartering highlights the extreme measures that authoritarian regimes took to enforce their authority. Reflecting on such practices underscores the importance of safeguarding human rights and promoting fairness in legal systems. A call for humanity. Remembering these acts of cruelty encourages us to build a more humane and just world. It serves as a reminder of how far society has come in its pursuit of compassion and equality. Conclusion. Quartering remains one of history's most horrific methods of punishment, illustrating both the physical and psychological extremes of human cruelty. While such practices are now confined to the dark pages of history, they remind us of the urgent need to protect human dignity and ensure justice for all. Through reflecting on these brutal methods, we can appreciate the progress made in creating a fairer and more humane society, while also recognizing the importance of continuing to uphold human rights in the present and future. In this video, we took a close look at the dark side of human history and its most brutal punishments. These terrifying methods, which remain in the shadow of the past, remind us how justice and power can be distorted. Understanding these pages of history not only teaches us about the past but also serves as a warning to prevent the repetition of these mistakes in the future.
In this video, we took a close look at the dark side of human history and its most brutal punishments. These terrifying methods, which remain in the shadow of the past, remind us how justice and power can be distorted. Understanding these pages of history not only teaches us about the past, but also serves as a warning to prevent the repetition of these mistakes in the future. But we're not stopping here. In our upcoming videos, we will dive deeper into the different torture methods used throughout history, struggles for power, and the impact of wars on humanity. Keep following us to learn the truths behind these tragic events. We will continue to explore the secrets hidden in the depths of history together. See you in the next video. Take care.